Hello, my name is Jerron Vale from the Missouri Department of Higher Education and Workforce Development. Our equity project began a little over a year ago with a vision for addressing inequities and educational disparities for Missouri citizens. The department's desire is to build a careful process for addressing inequities and show our commitment toward equitable outcomes for all Missourians aligned with our vision to empower every Missourian with the skills and education needed for success. The Building Bridges series is an informative look at how Missouri's colleges, universities, and community organizations are addressing equity. We hope you learn from these shared experiences, and thank you again for joining us.
All right, we'll get started. I think, the clock is saying noon, so interested time, we'll get started. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Jerron Vale, Program Specialist, Office of Post-Secondary Policy. This is my first time running the show, so if something happens, I do apologize, but we'll get through it. All right, so cool. All right, a couple housekeeping tips before we get started. The session is being recorded and will be up on our website soon after the presentations. All attendees should be muted. If not, please mute yourself so we can all listen to the speaker. And then add your questions into the chat for the presenters. And once the presentation is done, we'll get through those questions for you. All right, so let me go ahead and introduce our speaker for today. Speaker today is Emily Witt. She's the Chief Administrative Officer for Ohio School of Phlebotomy and Affiliated Schools. This Emily's really cool because she's actually somebody I've worked with before. She's been great to work with, great to talk to. So I'm sure you'll enjoy today's session. Emily completed just a little background on her. Emily completed her Bachelor's of Science at The Ohio State University College of Education and Human Ecology and attained the credential of Certified Clinical Medical Assistant through the Ohio School of Phlebotomy in 2012. She holds a Master's of Education in Adult Education from Pennsylvania State University. Emily is responsible for adherence to academic standards, as well as overseeing compliance with school and state policies and regulations at Ohio School of Phlebotomy and its sister schools. She is passionate about medical education and seeing each student develop their skills to become a talented medical professional, integral part of the medical team. So with that, I introduce always wonderful Emily Witt. Thank you so much for being with us.
Okay, so today's topic of discussion is titled Access and Outcomes, a New Era for Career and Technical Education. My intention with this presentation is to open a discussion and a dialogue both internally for each of us as stakeholders in the educational field and as a group, as an industry, to really challenge our thinking about career and technical education. Primarily, I'll be talking about and thinking from the perspective of a post-secondary educational experience, but we will also have some discussion about CTE or career and technical education at the secondary level, because I believe that a post-secondary discussion is remiss without talking about CTE as a pathway, which can start very early in an educational experience, or it can start much later in life, much later in an educational experience. So we'll be taking kind of a comprehensive look at the CTE throughout the educational journey, but with a focus on post-secondary. As we engage in this discussion, I want to really challenge myself and hopefully each of you to approach this topic thinking about our own privilege where it exists, our own biases, our own preconceptions about the field of career and technical education, about the learners that we work with. Some of these preconceptions or biases may be very overt. They may be pretty obvious when you look at the field. They may be subtle. They may be something that you hold in your subconscious. So just start thinking from a perspective of open-mindedness that we all have areas to improve in. We all have areas to challenge our own beliefs in. And we, as a field, in post-secondary education in general, and I believe in CTE in particular, have a lot of room to grow. So we'll be approaching this from that perspective. And with all of that being said, let's go ahead and get started. So I want to start with just some definitions in equity. As I said, with career and technical education, I am primarily coming from a practice and a perspective of post-secondary, but we will be delving into a little bit of secondary CTE as well. When it comes to talking about equity, I think it's important to be particularly clear about what we're talking about. I did pull these definitions from a few different academic papers, and I felt that they were a really good way to summarize what we're thinking about when we think about equity in education. So this first definition, equity in education, is defined as the process involved in achieving the ultimate goal of equality. Equity in education provides students with the varied, additional, or differentiated supports needed to achieve equality. So I think it's really important to start by understanding the difference between equity and equality. This may be a familiar difference to many of us, but I feel like sometimes those two things get equated and they're not the same. Equity is making sure that we're accommodating in appropriate ways to level the playing field for our learners and in order to achieve equality, which is the ultimate goal. Equity gaps can be defined as differences in results between various categories of students. So when we look at different cohorts, different demographics, we can see through research, through analysis of the field, the different equity gaps that may exist in their outcomes and results, both during their enrollments, prior to their enrollments, during their enrollments, and after graduation. Finally, operationalized equity is a reduction of bias in education. So this is the intention that we as stakeholders in the process come to the table with. We need to operationalize our approach by actively and intentionally engaging in a reduction of bias wherever possible. And again, this starts with challenging our own beliefs, practices, and bringing that to everything we do, even the small things in our educational practice. So today we're going to be examining three key areas in this discussion. The first is career and technical education. From a 1,000-foot overview, we're going to talk about some history, we're going to talk about some challenges, we're going to talk about why it has the reputation it does in some circles, possibly even in our own minds. We're going to talk about accessibility in terms of CTE, some barriers to accessibility, what accessibility looks like, and if and how CTE can be a solution to that. Finally, we'll take a look at outcomes. That discussion will focus on the outcomes of CTE learners from various perspectives and the benefits that CTE can provide when correctly and intentionally delivered to students. So let's get started by just having an overview of CTE as a field. In this overview, we're going to talk about three different subcategories. We're going to start by looking at the history of CTE, some challenges in CTE, both past and present, and then finally, what does the CTE landscape look like now? So for us as educators, for the students who engage in CTE, what has changed, what has maybe not changed, what needs to change, and what are we working with as educational institutions, and what are our learners working with as the learners within that system. So let's start by just taking a quick look at the history of CTE. So I think it's really important to start any discussion of career and technical education talking about how problematic career and technical education has been at certain points in its history. And in my mind, to this day in some ways. So when we talk about CTE having a problematic history, we need to start by talking about tracking, particularly in K-12 education. If you look at the history of tracking, it's deeply rooted in segregation, both segregation of immigrant populations, segregation of Black students. It began as a way to differentiate learners into groups with a negative intention and intending negative outcomes. So the idea of tracking was to put students in basically one of three areas as they engage in their educational endeavors. They could go into either a vocational track, a general track, or a college prep pathway. Those three pathways had very different outcomes for learners. They were given very different opportunities in schools, very different resources as learners, and they were set up with a different intention of outcomes through the public system and the private education system. So when we talk about CTE, it was generally utilized as a non-achievement based pathway. It was an alternative to college, an alternative to continuing education. And those roots were there from the beginning, and they remain there. They will never go away. That is the history of tracking in education. Ability grouping is a more common pathway now. We look at what students' outcomes are after certain assessments, certain tests. This still is controversial, and just depending on how you approach it and utilize it in K-12 education. But for the most part, the difference is that there is some mobility within ability grouping. So if a student improves on their math scores, they may be moved into a different a math grouping going forward. So rather than putting a label on a student that they are going to be in one of these 3 pathways, we now approach students in terms of their ability in the moment. So we're not going to get further into that discussion today, but that is sort of the alternative form that tracking has taken in modern education. This has had lasting implications both for the learners who were subject to this type of educational approach, but also lasting implications for the field of vocational education. And again, we can't argue with that. We can't say that didn't happen, but we can say that it can look different now. So when we talk about career and technical education, we can have an intention for it that it is going to be a career opportunity. It is going to be a learning endeavor for the students that wish to partake in CTE, and look at it in a more positive light and in a way that is not rooted in the same approach that it was perhaps initially. So the other history of career and technical education that we would be remiss to not talk about is the more recent history of predatory post-secondary career and technical schools. So I think we all remember, circa 2018, 2019 or thereabouts, even a little earlier for some institutions, we saw a huge wave of private for-profit institutions, very large ones, who were sort of the public face of career and technical post-secondary education to the average American. We saw a huge wave of problems, closures, loss of accreditation, which was another hit to the field of CTE overall, in my opinion. Those institutions were ultimately losing their accreditation and shutting down for a variety of issues, for predatory marketing, for predatory loan practices, and various other reporting issues in terms of their outcome data. So when we talk about CTE, I think it's fair for learners, for other stakeholders to all be a little bit skeptical about career and technical education as an educational pathway, because they've seen the worst side of it, and in a very public way. So that's just something to keep in mind as we move forward, and something to hold ourselves accountable for as institutions, those of us that work in career and technical ed. In the 2016 to 2018 academic year, over 100 for-profit institutions closed. This was a record-breaking number, and record-breaking in a very huge way. So those would be the large for-profit institutions. So it was just a very notable occurrence within the field. So something to keep in mind as we understand any hesitations that students or the field of education as a whole has when it comes to CTE. Talking about those challenges, the reputation is rooted in the history that can lead to distrust among students, regulators, and even employers. Employers may have a desire to sort of discriminate against students who are educated in career and tech versus those who went to a 2 or 4 year institution, just because they are aware of some of those issues that they've seen in the field. Because of that, CTE can be seen as less than compared to degree-seeking pathways. I think particularly this can be a challenge for learners and institutions who issue certifications and certificates rather than maybe longer programs that issue an associate level or associate equivalent credential. And there is overall a lack of research and data transparency throughout the field. So if you look at educational research, there's a huge body of educational research in K-12 education. There is overall a lack of research being performed in adult education comparatively. And when you get into career and technical education, there is even more of a lack of research. So the lack of reputation for CTE among some stakeholders is not without cause, and it's certainly an area of improvement that we can engage in as stakeholders in encouraging, requesting, and utilizing the research and data where it exists. So I encourage all of you to be looking at data and actively asking for data when you can. The second challenge in CTE is regulation. As I'm sure many of you are aware, there's a very big difference in federal regulation when we talk about non-degree credentials and programs versus degree credentials and programs. So many CTE schools can operate without ever interacting at a federal level with regulation. Accreditation is varied throughout the fields of CTE, throughout the types of practice, the types of credential, and additionally, the state-to-state differences in regulation of certificate level and non-accredited programs create inconsistencies. So the states, do regulate CTE education, and they do so well, in my opinion. But there are differences in how it's regulated, and that can lead to confusion among students, employers, and within the field. So the differences in regulation and the lack of emphasis on funding compared to maybe degree education can lead to some challenges for CTE learners and institutions and the field as a whole. Finally, when we look at CTE, there are challenges that remain in equity and accessibility, and hopefully we'll be able to dig into those as we move throughout this presentation. The first thing that we need to talk about is that CTE still shows significant disparities in terms of race and gender enrollments and outcomes. And we will talk more about those differences a little later in this presentation, but there is still a huge amount of work to be done in operationalizing equity within the field of CTE, both at a post-secondary and secondary level. There are technological and literacy gaps that create barriers to certain CTE students. So there's a decent amount of research that, particularly in the era of COVID, as technical education has moved online, whether it's hybrid or as a whole for a program, that has created increased gaps for populations that may have less access to internet technology, may have fewer electronic devices at home to utilize for such learning. And so the gaps that already existed in CTE have been exacerbated for rural populations, urban populations, just populations with differences in access to online educational resources. Finally, much of the federal and state CTE specific legislation, so specifically I'm thinking about Perkins 5, fails to specifically address racial and gender equity within the field of post-secondary education. So if you read the language, the definitions within the legislation that does exist on this topic, they will talk about various demographics that may be what they consider to be special populations, special learners, and they neglect to specifically prioritize racial and gender equity within education, which, as we'll discuss, is a huge challenge for the field and is something that I believe we need to be intentional about as institutions within the field and as regulators. So what does the landscape look like now? That those equity challenges come from a lack of accountability in some ways. So let's look at the equity challenges. So there's significant disparities in post-secondary CTE outcomes exist between students of color and white students within post-secondary CTE programs, whether that be community and technical colleges. These gaps are wider in online programs, as I just discussed. Identifying and narrowing these disparities is important because research has shown positive labor market returns of community and technical college certificates and degrees, especially in health-related and technical fields. So I did want to talk a little bit too about the initiatives that Missouri is undergoing right now. If you know anything about those, they're very good. They're encouraging those CTE pathways to start earlier for students, to have them become more engaged and to address the equity gaps for students as they start in their CTE journey. So these gaps do exist, but we see solutions forming, and that's a very positive trend within the field. When we look at the way COVID-19 affected this, we see that the COVID-19 related drops in post-secondary CTE enrollments, particularly in 2020, disproportionately affected Black and Latinx students compared to their white peers. So that's just a further exacerbation of the equity gaps within CTE. Of the 14 different certificate fields that were studied in one study, 12 are extremely sex segregated, meaning that 3 out of 4 certificate holders are of the same sex. Compared to men, women earn certificates that bring them limited earnings returns. Certificates wage premium over a high school diploma is 27% for men and just 16% for women. So for men who engage in CTE pathways, they are going to make more for certificate level education compared to women. And that is due to differences both in gender equity within pay, but also in the careers that are typically pursued by men versus women. When we look at the accountability in the current landscape of CTE, increasing industry standards and accountability is crucial to entering this new era. So if stakeholders want to improve this, we need to be accountable and have those standards set within the field to increase consistency, increase outcomes, and make sure that we are delivering quality CTE to the learners that are seeking it. Without further research and broader research on educational outcomes and effectiveness, and transparency in data collection and aggregation, little can improve. So we need to see the data being brought into our practice, the data being collected, and the analysis being performed before we can truly have a change in the way we approach CTE as a field. So next we're going to talk about accessibility. So when we think about accessibility in education, there's a wide breadth of areas that affect a learner's access to education. And this is true of any type of education, but we will be looking at it in terms of CTE specifically. So the first is perhaps one of the ones we think of most often, and that is financial accessibility. Can a learner afford to pursue additional education after their K-12 experience? I was just reading in Inside Higher Ed before hopping on this call that a learner's perception of whether they can afford post-secondary education has a huge impact on whether they even choose to pursue it. So of students who said, yes, my family or I as a learner can afford post-secondary education, 80% of those students who believed that they could afford it did go on to pursue post-secondary education. Of the students who said, no, my family or I could not afford post-secondary education, only 59% of those students went on to pursue post-secondary education. So although there are financial programs, financial assistance, loans, scholarships, grants, state funding, federal funding, there are resources out there. But one of the gatekeeping problems we have in education is that learners may not be as aware of those resources as we are as administrators, educators, regulators. So there is a huge impact on accessibility for learners who believe they can afford school versus those who believe they cannot. So when we talk about accessibility in education and career and technical education, we need to be mindful of whether the offerings within the field of CTE are accessible and whether there is clear and useful communication about the costs of those programs and the resources available to our learners. Location can be an accessibility consideration. Is an institution or a program located in an area where a learner has access to it? For our learners that utilize public transport, is this a location that is walkable or approachable through a public transport route? Is the location available to learners who utilize cars, who are coming from a great distance, maybe from a rural location into an urban center? So there are differences in if you look at the field of CTE, what types of programs, what types of institutions are available in different locations. You may see different types of technical practice and career education located in more rural environments versus urban environments. And so we need, as a field, to think about accessibility in terms of the location of our offerings. The prerequisites required for pursuing CTE are definitely something to consider. What types of barriers are our learners facing when they come to a CTE pathway, whether that's at the secondary level or the post-secondary level? If we're requiring a high school diploma for certain programs, is that necessary? Is that excluding learners that maybe could benefit from those pathways? If we're requiring certain grades at the secondary level, is that fairly excluding learners? So just being aware and cognizant about maybe more traditional prerequisites that are not rooted in the benefit of the student. So some student first thinking on prerequisites for programs and how that affects learners that will have access to the outcomes associated with career and technical education. There's accessibility considerations wrapped up in the enrollment process. So students will often need to be guided through the enrollment process. And I think that as institutions and as administrators, there's sometimes things that get taken for granted in that process, things that aspects of the enrollment process that for us are very familiar and for students are very new. So when you think about a CTE learner approaching maybe their first program enrollment, think about it from fresh eyes. What do they need to know to be successful in the enrollment process, whether that's an application or registration, in getting all of their documentation together, whatever the program requires? How can we accommodate to ensure that we are not creating unnecessary and artificial barriers to getting started in a program? Because as we can look at the research all day on attrition, on outcomes, and if we're just looking at that information and not thinking about the beginning of the process, we are definitely excluding learners that may be interested in or would benefit from CTE, but we're facing barriers in getting started. So let's think about the enrollment process as an accessibility consideration. Another aspect of accessibility is the time commitment to a program. And this is one thing that I think CTE can do really well when we approach it correctly. So if we have a student who is looking to change their career, to start in a different job pathway, and they're looking at a 2-year degree or a 4-year degree, especially if that student needs to work part-time or full-time alongside their education in order to sustain their health, well-being, and their family, the time commitment involved in completing a 4-year degree or a 2-year degree may be completely out of the question for them at this moment in their life or at any moment in their life. And CTE can offer alternatives. So when we look at CTE from a lens of accessibility, it's important to think about how we are approaching the time that we're asking for from our students. How are we maximizing that time as educational programs and institutions? How are we efficiently delivering education to get them through their educational experience while respecting the other responsibilities and burdens that their life is placing on them? School is not the only thing our learners are facing, and it's important for us to be respectful and mindful of that. A related consideration is the schedule of our programmatic offerings. When we think about accessibility, we have to consider the time commitments that students are spending with their children, in their jobs, perhaps in dual enrollments in education, caring for older loved ones or younger loved ones. When we think about the schedule of our offerings, CTE can provide a pathway, alternative to maybe all-day enrollments or multiple day a week enrollments at the 2 or 4-year degree level. The next consideration in accessibility is program adaptability. And again, I think this is something that CTE can do really well when we approach it with intention. So program adaptability is, in my mind, the biggest factor in student retention. So if our goal as an educational institution or field is to reduce attrition and see positive student outcomes, the number one thing we can do is approach our programs and our enrollments with adaptability and accommodation. Students are coming to us with all sorts of challenges, and it is our job as stakeholders in the educational process to make sure that those challenges are removed or mitigated wherever we can help. So whether that's working with students on any of these accessibility considerations we're talking about here, or just rethinking the way we offer career and technical education. Being adaptable is one of the top things that we as a field can do to make education accessible at the CTE level. Next, we're going to talk about institutional bias and gatekeeping. This is a big one. I think as institutions, as educators, as faculty, we have a big responsibility to think about the power differential, the biases, the institutionalized discrimination that our field as a whole can be very, very culpable for, but very guilty of. So when we think about institutional bias and gatekeeping, we need to constantly challenge ourselves to think about, what am I as an administrator or an educator doing to challenge my own approach to this? And as an institution, how am I considering, ways to mitigate the power differential even in the classroom of, what's being offered to students and how we're approaching students and respecting them. Finally, outcomes are an accessibility consideration. So accessibility is not just getting a student into the classroom and helping them, finish out their program. Accessibility is also a consideration of what we're offering the student. Are we giving them a quality outcome that's going to benefit them? Are we taking advantage of them by offering them a program that may not give them a positive outcome? Or are we ensuring that we are giving them something that's going to make their investment in this educational opportunity a positive one? So when we think about access, we also need to think about the outcomes associated with access to that education, especially through the lens of equity. Because if we're here to, as an educational field, if we're here to mitigate some of those equity gaps within the educational practice, we have to think about what is happening to students after they leave the classroom. Are we actually empowering them, enabling them, and giving them a positive outcome from their investment of time, of money, of effort? And if that's true, then we've done our job. And if it's not, then we need to constantly reevaluate. So when we talk about outcomes, we're going to look at 3 different areas here. Outcomes as a continuing education consideration, in terms of the careers granted to learners, and finally, in terms of the economic stability and quality of life offered to our graduates out of the CTE pipeline. So when we look at continuing education, this is where we need to also think about CTE at the secondary level. So high school students who were CTE concentrators were more likely than non-concentrators to earn an associate's degree as their highest level of educational attainment within 8 years of their expected high school graduation. So when we look at starting CTE pathways earlier in a student's educational journey, we see that that is associated with positive outcomes, including in longer term educational commitments like 2-year programs. A recent study also showed that CTE participants were 10% more likely to graduate high school and showed significantly higher standardized test scores. So this shows that those engaged in CTE at the secondary level are seeing gains in their academic performance outside of just that CTE credential. These increases were higher among male students versus female students. So again, we're seeing another one of those equity gaps within the field of CTE, starting at the secondary level, and that does increase and continue through the post-secondary practice. So looking at the career outcomes for CTE students, 53, this is not CTE, but looking at, to contrast, 53% of college graduates are currently unemployed or working in a field that does not require a college degree. And the reason I wanted to talk about this as we start our consideration of career outcomes in CTE is because as a field, as the educational field. And I think for the average American, there's this perception that a college degree is going to guarantee you something, is going to be a better choice, a better outcome. But interestingly, when we look at what happens to college graduates, those that are working within their field do make more money than CTE graduates. That's true. But 53% of college graduates are unemployed or working in a job that did not require them to take out the student loans to invest the 4 years or more commitment of time that they did. So the majority of students who have engaged in a college degree are not utilizing it, did not directly benefit from it in terms of a career pathway. So when we think about our CTE learners, I really want to challenge the stakeholders in the field to think about, when we compare CTE to college, let's stop thinking about CTE as less than or as a less desirable alternative. College can be a great pathway for students. I'm not here to demean college at all. I just want to be very real about the outcomes that our learners face. And as a field, we can certainly do more to support all of our graduates, whether they be college graduates or CTE graduates. But when we look at CTE, let's look at it as a legitimate alternative to college, considering that many of the careers that our college grads work in could have been acquired without additional education past the high school or certificate level. To talk more about this, high school students who were CTE concentrators were employed full-time at higher rates 8 years after their expected high school graduation compared to non-CTE concentrators. So again, we see that CTE starting earlier in a student's career can lead to greater outcomes in terms of their job placement rates. This can be of great benefit to students, whether they go on to further CTE or further degree level education or not. They're going to see higher employment rates just by virtue of being engaged with CTE earlier in their educational journeys. In a survey of CTE students, most respondents said that their last post-secondary certificate was either useful, 49% of students said that, or somewhat useful. Another 27% of students said that, in helping them to get a job. An even larger percentage, which was 83% of those respondents, said that the certificate program had improved their working skills, while 58% said it was useful in increasing their pay. So this study was done at the post-secondary level. So we're talking about post-secondary outcomes here. So when you look at that response rate, we're seeing that a great majority of students engaged in post-secondary certificates education found that did increase their career opportunities, increase their pay, gave them additional skills. And that's that type of positive outcome that we're looking for our students. So when we're talking about outcomes as an accessibility consideration, we're talking about outcomes that can assist in closing equity gaps by offering meaningful opportunities to our students. That's exactly the type of outcome that we're looking for. Finally, related to career, we need to talk about the economic stability and quality of life that CTE pathways can bring to our students. So in 19 states, the average debt of students who had a 4-year degree was more than $30,000, and it was over $35,000 in 6 additional states. So I just bring this up again to talk about when we're looking at the fact that 53% of college graduates are not working at all or in a field that required their degree. They're there and they're strapped with $30K plus in student debt. I'm one of them. I am working in my field, but I think we may all be a little bit familiar with the burden that student debt can put on financial well-being. That student debt, when it is associated with positive career outcomes and increased pay, is a price that you pay for that economic stability that you gain. But for the majority of our college learners, they are facing that type of debt without that type of increased pay. So it's just something to consider again when we talk about accessibility and CTE. If we're looking at lower cost programs and not the type of debt or price tag associated with a 2-year degree or 4-year degree, we can then see the economic stability up front as you enter your career is more of an assurance. 43% of young workers with licenses and certificates earn more than those with an associate's degree. So 43% of those who are new to their field, newly graduated, are actually earning more than those with an associate's degree. So again, something to keep in mind in terms of economic outcomes. 27% of young workers with licenses and certificates earn more than those with a bachelor's degree. And 31% of young workers with associate's degrees earn more than those with a bachelor's degree. So just thinking about these statistics in terms of the outcomes that can be available to learners at the CTE certificate and license level compared to those that have earned an associate's or a bachelor's. It can be a really meaningful economic change for learners as they enter the field without the accessibility barrier of the time commitment required for a 2-year or 4-year degree. So as institutions, as a field, if we're looking at those types of outcomes, and if we're able to increase those types of outcomes and close equity gaps in those types of outcomes, that is certainly our goal here. It is worth noting that these percentages decrease slightly over the lifetime of a worker. So those with 2-year and 4-year degrees over their lifetime will continue to earn more, whereas those with CTE pathway credentials may not grow at the same rate. So that is something to take in mind. It was a slight difference. It was not dramatically notable based on the research that was done here. 8 years after their expected graduation date, students who focused on CTE courses while in high school had higher median annual earnings than their peers who did not focus on CTE. So again, talking about secondary level CTE, we can see outcomes far into students' careers, into their livelihoods. So again, starting students early in CTE can be very, very beneficial. And finally, certificate holders are most likely to earn between $20,000 and $50,000 per year. This study was done on those with just certificates, so no further education beyond that, with 29% earning less than 20K and 29% earning more than 50K. So clearly that's a pretty large range. Fully half of certification holders reported making more than 50K a year, with a third making between 20K and 50K, and 17% making less than 20K. So we talk about this just to kind of make these numbers real for ourselves as we think about this. Clearly, this is going to be different by field. As we talked about, there are racial and gender equity differences in what students end up earning after their CTE education, so that's a consideration. But it is worth noting that there are positive economic gains in terms of the salaries earned by students as they come out of the CTE pipeline. And that should be our focus as a field, is increasing those and looking for the career opportunities, reinvesting in the reputation of our field so that employers see our graduates as desirable, as hireable, and assuring that our graduates are going to see that type of return on their investment. So in terms of economic stability, this is just one look at the gender equity difference that I found really interesting. So on the left here, you'll see that in this study, the men's earnings by education. So associate's degree holders, male, their average earning was over 50K, close to 51K. If you look to the right, the associate degree holders among women are 35K. So that's a pretty big gap, in my opinion. If you look at certificate holders, men were likely to make about 50K. That was their average earnings. And women who were certificate holders are looking at 32.6K. So again, pretty dramatic difference. And then certificate holders who are working out of their field, men are looking at 39K and women are looking at 22. If you look down to the high school diploma holders at the bottom of this graph, Men are earning close to 35K, whereas women are earning closer to 24. So I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here. Hopefully it's not a surprise that women are still earning less than men. I think that is pretty well known. Not okay, but hopefully a well-known fact. If you didn't know about it, now you do, and you can go try and do something about it. So when we look at the differences in educational attainment, though, we're seeing that men, let's just look at the left. Let's just look at men who hold an associate's. Those with an associate's are making about 50K, and those with a certificate who are working in their field are also making about 50K. So again, we're seeing comparable economic stability outcomes for those with a 2-year degree versus those with a certificate, a CTE certificate in their field. If you look at those working with a certificate out of their field, that does drop. That does drop down to 39K. So similarly, if you look just at the right, just at the women's earnings, associate's degree holders are earning about 35K. Certificate holders are earning 32.6. So women do see a little bit less earnings with certificates versus associates when you look at that gap between associates and certificates versus men. And again, that is exacerbated if that certificate holder is working outside of their field of education. But again, you can see that certificates and associates are pretty similar in terms of earnings when you consider for just women or for just men. But I think this is a very dramatic and hopefully salient example of the type of equity gaps that we do see still in CTE outcomes. So this is certainly something for us as educators, as stakeholders, to be invested in intentionally seeking solutions for our learners and for the field as a whole. Because when we look at outcomes, we want to make sure that our learners are getting return on their investment, and for our female learners to be making so much less after their investment in education is not all right. So again, those equity considerations should be at the forefront of our discussions of outcomes. So in conclusion, when we encourage CTE pathways, we need to consider all of these accessibility considerations, the inequities and the history of CTE, and how we are going to continue to intentionally fix those to encourage positive outcomes, whether that be in terms of educational attainment, economic stability, continuing education. I personally believe that CTE can be a great benefit to our learners in helping them achieve a positive career pathway, to achieve positive career outcomes. I am a huge fan of CTE and a huge advocate for it, as long as we are aware of the challenges that the field faces and we are ready to take on those challenges and be intentional about the way we approach them. When we look at the stakeholders in this next chapter of CTE, I think it needs to be a little different than the stakeholders that we've traditionally associated with CTE. So, again, talking about those bigger institutions, that wave of closures 2016 to 2018, those for-profit schools were publicly traded. They were there for their shareholders, not their educational stakeholders. And so as institutions, as a field, we need to really dig into who the stakeholders are in career and technical education, the first and foremost being the students. If we approach CTE from a student-first perspective, we will be winning the battle here. So we need to consider the needs of the students, the accommodations we can provide to reduce attrition and present positive outcomes. But we also have stakeholders who need to be involved and need to be considered, and that's the schools and their ability to provide this positive educational experience. Regulators, we talked about the differences and consistency across the field, providing regulation. So maybe increased awareness, accountability, the research that will enable those things to be true. The employers that hire CTE students and how we as a field can change their perception of CTE and encourage the employers to see our students as desirable, as hireable, and what can we do to ensure that our programs are preparing students positively to give employers what they need in the field. And finally, looking at the funding considerations, one of those key accessibility considerations, how do we increase funding opportunities for students at the CTE level, and make sure that they're aware of the opportunities for funding that are available to them. So as we move forward into the next phase of CTE, I think we all have a huge responsibility, but also a huge privilege to be involved in the type of education that can influence a student's outcomes in positive ways. And I'm confident that as a field, we can and will continue to do better in a way that will benefit our students and their outcomes for years to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was really awesome. Awesome presentation. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna have a couple questions here and just kind of start things off. I think what's two things I found really important about what you're saying, particularly about, expanding what we kind of define as career, college education, expanding that framework to include CTE, as some kids are meant for college, some aren't. So I think that's a good distinction that you made, and it's all good education. It's all worthwhile industries that are important for our state. You also mentioned about the for-profits, and at least in Missouri, at least the majority of those are gone pretty much. I think there might be one or two left. So I think, like, we're shifting that conversation away from the kind of seeing it as this all-inclusive thing, but it might be in other states. But as far as Missouri specifically, the majority of those have left during that 2016-2018 period. So that's a good distinction to make. Just real quick, somebody asked you, do you have you stated a Inside Higher Ed article. Do you know the name of that article that we can put in a link possibly?
Yeah, if you give me a minute, I'll get a link to that.
Cool. Thank you. And for another question, will the slide deck be shared? It will be on our website along with the recording. So you can look at the slides then after we are probably later on in the week, I'm sure, either later on this week or early next week. Okay, cool. And that's awesome. Thank you, Emily. Sure. I want to make another distinction about gender, which I thought was really, really interesting. I was actually, of course, in my other job where I met Emily. I worked with Emily in proprietary, the certified school side, doing site visits. I visited a welding institution for one of my site visits, and just kind of talking about the daily operations and how things were going and what their students were like. And the owner was like, what we need is actually more women. And he was saying is that he said we had a couple of women in our program, and they are the best welders because they are more detail oriented than their male counterparts, which I thought was really cool. So he was like, if we could find more women, that'd be great. So it's just like there is we're talking about diversity and equity. There is some spaces in the CTE that are really looking to diversify those programs. So I thought that was really interesting. So if you have any more questions, please put them in the chat. I just wanted to ask a quick question to you, Emily. Now that things are starting to kind of, it's still, things are still difficult. We are getting a lot of information about how a lot of those gaps, particularly with a lot of retirements, particularly in Missouri. OA came out with some information that one of the biggest groups that will be in the state around 2030 will be of retirement age. So you have all of those people who are retiring, and which is going to expand the gap that needs to be filled as far as career and technical education. What are you seeing on the ground as far as the students that are coming through your doors? Are they more traditional age students? Are they adults looking for a second career? What is it like from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you anecdotally at our institutions, and just for those of you that, I don't know if this was said earlier, we have 8 schools across 7 states where I work. So across all those schools, we are seeing a pretty diverse age range. I would say the majority of our students are still what you would consider traditional enrollment age, so out of high school into their 20s. But we certainly have quite a population of students who are career changers or who are starting their CTE journey later in life. One article that I read recently, and I don't think I cited it in this slide deck, but it said that compared to, the differences in age in enrollment of CTE versus 2 and 4 year degrees is dramatic. And again, I think that's a time consideration and other accessibility consideration. But about a third of students who enroll in CTE, post-secondary CTE programs are above the age of 40. Which is dramatically different than what you would see in a college environment. So this can certainly be an opportunity for, as the economy changes, the needs of employers change, we can see some transitional education for our learners across America and in Missouri as they can look for different educational pathways through CTE.
Cool, thank you. Do you see any movement on any as far as state regulating of CTE? You mentioned earlier that a lot of states, and Missouri is very into that. We have a CTE certificate and some other things, career pathways. Do you see in your experience that students are asking for more of a pathway model of like, show me where I can start from and where I can end versus let me just get the certificate and kind of figure it out on my own? What are you seeing as far as your institution?
Yeah, I think as far as our institution goes, we're seeing a lot of learners who, we have a good representation of learners who started CTE earlier in their careers, maybe started in high school with something like a home health aide credential, and then my field is healthcare, and then continued their education in CTE with us in healthcare. We're seeing those who are transitional from a different field, and also those who have a high school diploma or a GED. About a third of our learners are GED students, so not high school graduates. And they're coming now to start a career pathway after earning their GED. So that's certainly what we're seeing. And I can say, as among the different states, there is more of an emphasis on CTE starting at the secondary level and continuing through post-secondary. And I think that, there is some increased interest in that, increased regulation. I think although I focused on certificate and, certification licensure level, CTE here, I think it's pretty clear that the Biden administration has been intentional about encouraging associate's degrees and other technical pathways. I think that's great. So I think we're seeing that trend. I think we're seeing regulators at the federal and state level encouraging these pathways and students at all levels paying attention to that.
Awesome. That's much. And let me see, I think we just got one more question here. Yeah, awesome. That's really good. You mentioned that literally seeing at the secondary level. I think that's what I know in Missouri we're trying to really work with earlier, starting earlier with those students. And what is, because I know final question, Ohio Schools of Botany has several institutions around the states. Do you see, I guess my question would be to follow up on that. Do you see a lot of a state starting to do that more, that what you're working with, particularly in Ohio and in Missouri? Do you see a lot of do you have high school counselors or young elementary counselors or anything like that are starting to sort of ask about your programs?
I have to say that Missouri has been exemplary in this area compared to the other states. We have more interest from high school counselors and students at both of our Missouri locations than anywhere else. So the investment in CTE that the state is making is paying off. But I would say there is a trend that we're seeing this more commonly everywhere. And we're seeing students interested in this earlier in their careers. So whether they're engaged in CTE or not, they're looking at career and tech outcome pathways as the next step in their education, rather than just thinking about like college or nothing. So I love seeing that people are seeing technical education as a next step following their graduations. And that's certainly happening across the board.
That's great. Okay, thank you. And we actually have a comment here. Rockhurst University, they created a credit-bearing medical assistant certificate program that students can complete in high school and then complete additional programs towards their associates. So that's really what, and it's also in the Commerce also offered at an affordable tuition rate. So we are seeing that lot of
Absolutely. And I think,
colleges and universities getting in that space. Mhm.
yeah, medical assisting is a great example of something that we can all celebrate across many levels. I mean, my institution offers a medical assisting certificate program that's spans 11 weeks. And so that's something students can accomplish pretty quickly. And then there's, of course, associate's programs available to students who have the time and desire to earn that credential. And so I love seeing technical fields where there is an ability for students to continue investing in their education at different levels. So medical assisting is a wonderful example of that.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. That's great. That's great. Well, I think we're running up here on time. I don't see any other questions in the chat. I do really, really appreciate your time, uh, Emily. This is really good because, like I said, I've talked to you quite a bit before doing site visits and such. So this has been really great. Thank you so much for being here with us. Again, we'll have the presentation and the slide deck up later on this week or early next week. But yeah, we'll really appreciate it, and thank you all for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Emily.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great week.